Vintage cakes are here to stay, and by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to make one. I have a massive love for decorating vintage cakes. I am excited to be sharing a new cake with you every week, and I'll show you exactly how I do it. I'll share all my tips and tricks. So let's get into it. If you don't have an anti-slip mat, you can also use a damp tea towel. I work with fluffy sponges, so I always like to soak my sponges with a little bit of sugar syrup, and then I'm gonna create this little dam to prevent my filling from falling out the sides. You want to make sure you spread your filling evenly before you're gonna apply the next sponge, and make sure you don't overfill your fillings. This was a major problem that I was having in the beginning. I was just being too generous with my fillings, and that will make your cake collapse. This is my standard 6-inch cake. I use 3 layers of sponges plus filling, and I'm using a 10-inch cake board. That gives me lots of space for the decorations afterwards. And because I am using fluffy sponges, you want to make sure you add creamy fillings in between so the sponges don't dry out. If you're interested in my recipes, drop a comment below. Now, when you are adding your sponges on top, try to align them as straight as possible already and make sure it's all nice and set in the middle of your cake board. Then we are going to apply a crumb coat. Now, a crumb coat is the first layer of buttercream you're gonna apply just to lock in all those little crumbs. Now, normally I always use plain buttercream for my crumb coat without any food coloring added to it, because too much food coloring will affect the taste of your buttercream. Now, this is a content cake made with buttercream left over from my cake and sip glasses. That is why it's a darker color already. You want to apply your buttercream generously on the outside of your cake until every little bit is covered before you're gonna go over there with your scraper. Now, it really matters how you hold your scraper, but the first scrape is mainly going to be to get rid of all that excess buttercream. So I'm just gonna go around it slowly, gently, don't put too much pressure, and then I'll just be using the leftover buttercream from my scraper to fill up all the gaps. You can see all the little gaps over there. That means buttercream needs to be added there to get the cake straight. Once you've filled up all the gaps, I'm going to get my scraper out and I'm going to go around the cake again. Now, it really matters how you hold your scraper. You want it on a 90-degree angle, so you want to make sure the bottom of your scraper is aligned with your board. Now, you want to get your crumb coat as straight as possible as you can already. That is going to make your life much easier when you're going to be applying the final coat. And this is how I hold my scraper. You definitely don't want to be putting too much pressure onto your cake, because that is going to create all these little ripples in the side. Also, a little side note, I am applying a very generous layer of crumb coat on my cake. Normally, you'll probably see your sponges coming through a little bit, which is completely fine. Then I'm going to be using my little offset spatula to get the sides in. I prefer to do it with a smaller one than a bigger one. It just gives me a little bit more control. Now, you could clearly see that the top of my cake was not straight at all. So I'm just going to apply a little bit more buttercream just to get that shape in. You really want to make sure your crumb coat is already setting the shape of your cake. You really want to make sure your crumb coat is already nice and neat, because the neater your crumb coat is, the easier for you it's going to be to apply the final coat and get that perfect straight shape. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but try to get it as neat as you can. After applying your crumb coat, you're going to pop it in the fridge and you're going to leave it in there for minimum half an hour. You want to make sure it's nice, hard and set before you're going to apply your final coat. I have rushed it a little bit here because you can see if you tap your finger on it and there's still buttercream on your finger, you probably want to leave it in there a little bit longer. It's really important you let your crumb coat and your final coat set properly in the fridge before you're going to be decorating. I have had a few times that I haven't done that and I was decorating the cake and it was just collapsing midway. And then for the final coat, you want to be applying a generous layer of buttercream on the outside until everything is covered. And then I'm going to get my scraper out again to get it nice and smooth. Now, remember, you want it on a 90-degree angle, so you want to make sure the bottom of your scraper aligns with your board and the side of your scraper sits nice and straight on the side of your cake. And then fill up the gaps. Now, I think a really, really important thing to know as well with your final coat is that your buttercream cannot be too cold. You probably want it a little bit more on the warmer side. That will give you that smooth finish. If you're applying cold buttercream on an already cold cake, you're gonna create all these little air gaps because the buttercream just doesn't have the space to smoothen out. If you ever run into that problem, what I like to do is I just pop the hairdryer on there a little bit. And then it's also really important that your buttercream is sticking over the side on the top of your cake. That is going to give you that perfect shape and those really straight edges in the end. Now, this process is probably repeated a few times before your cake is perfect. And what you want to do is you just want to go with your scraper and you're going to scrape the sides. You're going to keep filling up those gaps, keep repeating this process until your cake is completely smooth. You can easily tell where more buttercream needs to be added, and with me it's usually always on the top side of the cake. You can see those little gaps there where it's not completely straight yet, and you just keep repeating this process until there's no gaps on the side of your cake anymore. Then I'm going to be using my big offset spatula just to get those sides in. This doesn't need to be perfect yet because I will be repeating this process a few times as well. The easiest way to get the top of my cake straight, I find, is by using this big offset spatula. Hold it as straight as you can and be wary not to push the outside down too much. You really want the top of your cake to be super straight. Then I will be getting my scraper out again to get those sides straight. And you see there's a few little gaps that I've created there. So I'm just going to fill them up with a tiny bit of buttercream. Don't use too much as well because or else it's just going to bulge out. Now this process I find myself repeating quite a few times. I'm going to just keep doing this until I'm happy with my cake shape. So I'm going to get the scraper out. I'm going to scrape the sides. Then I've got my offset spatula. I'm going to get the top in and I'm just going to repeat this until I'm happy. Now, the best thing about vintage cakes is that it doesn't have to be completely perfect because we are going to be covering up those edges with beautiful borders anyway. I like to be working with 3 colors max when you are creating vintage cakes. And here's an easy way to create the 3rd color in the same color scheme. I just mix a little bit of both colors into one bowl. Now onto the fun part, the decorating. But you want to make sure your cake is completely chilled in the fridge before you're going to decorate it. I'm using a petal tip for this border, and if you're not confident how to space your border out, you can make a few little indents in the side of your cake so you have a little bit of a guideline. Now see how I paused there and I twisted up my piping bag? You really want to stay on top of it. You never want to let your piping bag get floppy, and you definitely don't want to be overfilling your piping bag as well. This will ensure you can put the right pressure. This little handy tool is called a coupler, and you can add that in your piping bag. And this way you can easily swap over in between piping tips without having to grab a new bag every time. The piping tip goes on the outside before you screw the ring back on. I'm using a little closed star piping tip for this border, and to create this border I'm moving my piping tip from left to right. So I'm basically making a zigzag movement, but to make this border look extra special, you can see where my bottom border is sticking out more. My swirls are going to be slightly bigger, and then when I'm coming back to the smaller bits, my swirl is not as big. I'm just going to be continuing this until I've reached the end, and you always want to make sure all your borders start at the same point. So that way, that is going to be the back of your cake, because it always looks a little bit messy and not perfect where those ends meet. Then I'm using an open star piping tip for my shell border. How to pipe shells: you want to squeeze, stop squeezing and pull away. And you want to pull away quite dramatically at the end to create that till. Then I'm going to swap over to a very small round tip or like a writing tip to create drop lines. Oops, I forgot to press record, so we've missed the beginning. But if you are interested in a tutorial about drop lines, please let me know in the comments. The most important tip I will give you is you really want to let the buttercream fall out of your piping tip. I'm just adding a few little buttercream kisses, and I feel this is an easy way to pimp up your vintage cakes without too much effort. Now, this is a new piping tip I'm using. It is called the Ateco 87, but you can also easily use a normal leaf tip, or you can use your petal tip to create this kind of border. I am using my previous borders as some sort of guideline, how I'm going to place my ruffles, but you can also just make a little indent with your piping tip in the side of your cake if you want to have some sort of guideline to follow along. Then I'm going back to my closed star piping tip, the same that we used for the second border, and I'm doing the same movement. So I'm doing a small zigzag, a big zigzag, back to a small zigzag. Now they still look a little bit messy, and that is because I haven't cleaned my piping tip. You always want to make sure there's no excess buttercream on the outside of your piping tip, because that will definitely affect your shells. I'm just going to add these single drop shells where all my ruffle ends meet, just so it looks a little bit cleaner. I haven't done that with this cake, but I love to just add a little pearl on the bottom. Then I'm going to go back to my closed star piping tip, and I'm just going to add a little shell border here on the side just to cover up all the things that nobody really wants to see. Back to the petal tip, the same one that I did my first border with, and I'm now going to use the lap over technique. So instead of moving it in a zigzag motion, I'm going to move from left to right, and I'm going to make it lap over. Now always stay on top of your piping bag. Never let it go floppy. If you need to have a pause, you can just stop your ruffle. You can twist up your piping bag, and then you can just continue where you left off. Make sure your skinniest part of your petal tip is on the outside to really get that defined line in there. Now then I'm going to be creating the same type of border on the inside, but I'm gonna turn over my piping tip. So the skinniest part is on the inside, because that is the part that you will see. And now I do this because or else there's not enough space to put your big shells on top, and they're just gonna fall into the middle, and they're not gonna be sitting straight on your cake anymore. For my big shells on top of my cake, I'm using a bigger closed star piping tip. Squeeze, stop squeezing, pull away. Squeeze, stop squeezing, pull away. I'm just going to be adding a few piped details here and there. There's really no rules. This is where you can just get creative and fill up any open spots. And now that is how you make a pretty vintage cake. I'll be sharing a new vintage cake with you every week, so make sure you are subscribed, and I'll see you in the next one.